Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the world grow soft and quiet around you. Let the day you have lived settle gently behind you, and let it go. Loosen your shoulders. Let your hands fall open. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and find its own easy rhythm, the way the breath does when nothing at all is being asked of you. And let me carry you a very long way from here. More than 2,500 years into the past, across the deserts and the rivers of the ancient East, to a great walled city on the banks of a wide brown river, a city of blue gates and towering temples and crowded streets, the largest and richest city in the world in its day, and one of the most famous names that has ever been spoken by human beings, Babylon. Picture it now, in the golden light of an early evening long ago. You are walking along a broad, paved processional way, and on either side of you rise walls of glazed brick, in the deepest blue you have ever seen, a blue like the sky just after sunset, and set into that blue in glowing yellow and white. March the figures of lions, one after another, their mouths open, their manes bright, striding along beside you as you walk. The paving stones are warm beneath your feet from the heat of the day. Ahead of you rises an enormous gateway of that same brilliant blue, studded with the figures of bulls and strange horned dragons, and beyond it, over the rooftops, you can see the great step tower of the city rising in stages toward the sky, its topmost shrine catching the last of the sun. All around you is the noise and warmth of a living city. Merchants are packing up their stalls for the evening. A donkey laden with reed baskets picks its way along the edge of the street. Somewhere a woman is calling her children home. There is the smell of dust, and river water, and smoke, and baking bread, and the sharp green scent of date palms. From the doorway of a mud brick house comes the sound of someone singing, low and unhurried, as they work. Priests in white linen pass on their way to the temple. A scribe hurries by with a wet clay tablet held carefully in both hands, the marks still fresh upon it. And over it all lies the deep, contented hum of a great city settling into its evening, as it has settled 100,000 evenings before, and as it will settle for years yet to come. Tonight, we are not going to follow the story of a war, or the rise and fall of a dynasty, or the fate of a king. Tonight we are going to do something quieter, and I think more intimate. We are going to ask what it was actually like to live there. What was it like to be an ordinary person in ancient Babylon, to wake in one of those mud brick houses, to eat the food they ate, to do the work they did, to raise children and pay debts, and worry about the harvest, and go to bed at night beneath that ancient sky? For behind the famous names and the great monuments, Babylon was, above all, a place where hundreds of thousands of ordinary people simply lived, and loved, and worked, and grew old. And their lives are known to us in remarkable detail, because they wrote everything down on clay, and the clay survived. Tonight we will walk through their city and their days together. We will pass through the great blue gate and see the streets and the river and the walls. We will step inside an ordinary house and see how a family lived, what they ate and drank, how they slept through the hot nights. We will follow a child to school and watch them learn the fearsome art of writing on clay. We will visit the markets and the workshops, meet the brewers and the weavers and the boatmen, and see how a person earned their bread. We will sit in on a lawsuit and read a marriage contract, and look into the temples where the gods of the city were fed and clothed each day like living kings. We will climb the great tower and stand on the walls and watch the stars come out over the plain, as the astronomers of Babylon watched them, night after night, for centuries. And at the end, we will let the city go quiet around us, and let it sink back into the long silence of the past. There is nothing you need to remember tonight. There will be no test in the morning, and nothing here you must carry with you into sleep. If your thoughts begin to drift and wander, let them drift. If sleep comes to gather you up before we reach the end of the story, then let it come, and welcome, For that is exactly what this quiet hour is for. The old city will still be standing in the dark, and I will still be here, telling its long story softly, whether you hear the end of it tonight or not. And if you find that these calm histories help to carry you down toward rest, you might gently tap the like button, and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you and to others who lie awake in the dark and are looking for something quiet to hold on to. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now let the modern world dissolve entirely, and let us go back across the centuries, to a great city on a wide brown river, in the golden light of an evening, 2,500 years ago. Let us begin by placing the city, and placing ourselves in time, for Babylon was very old even when it was at its greatest, and the Babylon we are visiting tonight is only one of its many lives. The city stood in the flat, hot, fertile plain of southern Mesopotamia, the land between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now the country of Iraq. This was the oldest settled land in the world, the place where farming villages had first grown into towns, and towns into the first true cities, thousands of years before anyone spoke the name of Babylon. Cities had risen and fallen on that plain for 2,000 years before Babylon amounted to anything at all. When Babylon first appears in the records, it is a small and unremarkable town on a minor branch of the Euphrates, of no importance to anyone. It rose to greatness first under a king named Hammurabi, some 18 centuries before the Common Era, a shrewd and patient ruler who conquered his neighbors one by one until he had made Babylon the mistress of the whole land, and who is remembered above all for the great collection of laws he had carved on a tall pillar of black stone, one of the most famous documents to survive from the ancient world. That first Babylonian empire flourished, and then faded, and for 1,000 years afterward the city went through long centuries of rising and falling, conquest and recovery, sometimes ruling, more often ruled, sacked more than once, and always, somehow, enduring, always rebuilding, always remaining the great sacred and cultural heart of the land, even when the political power lay elsewhere. And then, in the last flowering of its long life, some 600 years before the Common Era, Babylon rose again to a glory greater than it had ever known. The mighty empire of Assyria, which had dominated the whole region for centuries, collapsed. And out of that collapse the Babylonians emerged as the new masters of the ancient East. Under a line of energetic kings, and above all under the great builder king Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was rebuilt on a scale of magnificence that astonished everyone who saw it, and became the capital of a broad empire and, for a few brilliant decades, the largest and most splendid city on the face of the earth, with a population that may have run to a couple of 100,000 souls. An enormous number for that age, greater than any city the world had yet seen. It is this Babylon, the Babylon of its final golden age, that we will walk through tonight, the city of blue gates and massive walls and the great tower, the city that the traveling Greeks would write about with such wonder, the city whose name would echo down the centuries in scripture and legend as the very image of earthly splendor and pride. It was a city that was already ancient, that knew itself to be ancient, and that took enormous pride in that antiquity. Its people studied and copied texts that were already 1,000 years old in their own day. Its kings dug down into the foundations of old temples to find the inscriptions of long-dead rulers, and rejoiced when they found them, and carefully recorded what they had found. Living in Babylon meant living in a place with a past so deep that it made the present feel small, surrounded on every side by monuments and traditions and stories inherited from ancestors who were themselves inconceivably remote. If you had asked a Babylonian how old their city was, they would have told you, without hesitation, that it was older than memory, founded by the gods themselves at the beginning of the world. And the land they lived in shaped everything about that life. It was a flat land, and a hot one, and above all a dry one. Rain was scarce and unreliable, and in the long burning summers almost nothing fell at all. And yet this dry plain was one of the most fertile places on earth, capable of feeding a vast population. And the reason was the rivers. The Euphrates and the Tigris came down out of the northern mountains, carrying water and rich silt across the plain. And for thousands of years the people of that land had learned to take that water and spread it across their fields through an immense and ancient network of canals and ditches and dikes. Everything depended on that water and on the work of managing it. Whole communities labored to dig the canals, to clear them of silt, to repair the banks, to open and close the sluices, to share out the water fairly among neighbors, and this endless collective labor was one of the great facts of Babylonian life, written into their laws, their disputes, their calendars, their prayers. Water was life, and the control of water was civilization. And out of that patient labor came the barley and the dates that fed the greatest city in the world. Now let us come to the city itself, and approach it as a traveler would have approached it, from out on the flat green plain. You would have seen it long before you reached it, for there was nothing to hide it. The land is table flat, and out of that flatness rose the walls. And above the walls the great tower, visible for many miles, growing slowly larger through the shimmering heat as you came on along the road. The walls of Babylon were famous throughout the ancient world, and when a Greek traveler came to describe them, a century or so after the city's golden age, he reported dimensions so vast that people have doubted him ever since. Walls so wide, he said, that a 4-horse chariot could be turned around on top of them. The archaeologists who dug at Babylon in modern times found the truth to be less extravagant than the traveler's tale, but astonishing enough: a double line of thick fortification walls, with a moat ringing an enormous city, and beyond them, out on the plain, a further great outer wall enclosing a vast additional area. Babylon was, by the standards of its age, almost unimaginably large, and its defenses were the wonder of the world. You entered by one of the gates, each named for a god, and if you came from the north you entered by the most magnificent of them all, the gate of the goddess Ishtar. Nothing in the ancient world looked quite like it. The whole structure was faced in glazed brick of a deep and luminous blue, and against that blue, in rows, marched the molded figures of bulls and of a strange horned creature, part serpent and part lion and part bird, the sacred beast of the city god. The colors were brilliant, the yellow and white of the animals glowing against that deep field of blue, and the whole thing must have blazed in the sun like something out of a dream. And leading up to it ran the great processional way, its high walls lined with those striding lions, glazed in the same brilliant colors. A road built for the parades of gods and kings, along which once a year the images of the gods themselves were carried in procession through a crowd of the whole city. Within the walls, the city was laid out with a regularity that was itself remarkable in the ancient world. Broad straight streets crossing one another, dividing the city into blocks, and through the middle of it all ran the Euphrates, splitting Babylon into 2 halves, east and west, joined by a bridge built on great piers of brick, along which the traffic of the city passed back and forth all day long. On the eastern bank stood the heart of the city, the royal palaces, the great temple of the city god, and the enormous stepped tower that rose above everything else. Around and between them spread the ordinary quarters, dense neighborhoods of flat-roofed mud brick houses, packed tightly together along narrow winding lanes, where the great mass of the people lived. And it is worth pausing on that word. Mud brick, for it is the material of which the whole of Babylon, from the humblest house to the greatest temple, was made. There is no good building stone in the southern Mesopotamian plain, and very little timber. What there is, in unlimited quantity, is mud, the fine river silt of the floodplain. And so the Babylonians built in mud, as their ancestors had for thousands of years. They mixed the clay with chopped straw, pressed it into wooden molds, and left the bricks to dry hard in the ferocious sun. For the most important buildings, and for surfaces exposed to the weather, they baked the bricks in kilns, which made them far more durable, and sometimes they glazed them in those brilliant colors. Everything else, all the ordinary houses of all the ordinary people, was built of the humble sun-dried brick, plastered over with more mud, and roofed with beams and reed matting, and a thick layer of packed earth. This meant that the city was in a sense made of the plain itself, of the very earth it stood on, and it also meant that it was always dissolving, and always being renewed. Mud brick is a fine building material in a dry land, cool in summer and warm in winter, cheap and easy to work. But it does not last. Rain eats at it. Damp rises into it. Walls slump and crack and need patching. Roofs need renewing. Every generation or so a house might need to be taken down and rebuilt on the leveled stump of the old one. And so the cities of that land rose slowly over the centuries on great mounds of their own accumulated debris, each generation building a little higher on the ruins of the last, until the ancient towns stood on artificial hills made of nothing but the compacted remains of their own long history. To live in Babylon was to live on top of 1,000 years of earlier Babylons, and to know it. Let us step now out of the great avenues and into the ordinary quarters, and see how a Babylonian family actually lived. For this is the heart of what we came to find. Turn off the processional way into a side street, and the city changes at once. The lanes are narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for a laden donkey, winding between high blank walls. There are few windows on the street, for the houses turn their backs on the outside world. What you see is a long wall of mud plaster, patched and repatched, with here and there a plain wooden door. The lane is unpaved and dusty, littered with the broken pottery that lies everywhere in every ancient city, and there is a channel down the middle for wastewater. Children play in the shade. A dog sleeps in a doorway. It is quiet, and close, and cool in the shadow between the walls. Push open one of those doors, and you find, not the dark hovel you might expect, but a small bright courtyard open to the sky, the true heart of the house. All the rooms of the house open onto this courtyard, and it is here that most of the life of the family takes place. In the courtyard there is an oven, a domed clay oven for baking bread, and a grinding stone where the barley is ground into flour, and large jars for water and for grain, and perhaps a small drain in the corner. The floor is beaten earth, swept smooth. In the heat of the day the courtyard is a well of hot light. In the evening it fills with cool shadow, and this is where the family gathers, where the food is cooked, where the neighbors call in, where the business of ordinary living goes on. Around this courtyard lie the rooms, and there are usually not many of them. A main room where the family sits and sleeps. One or two smaller rooms for storage, or for grinding, or weaving. Sometimes a room set aside for receiving guests if the family is well off. The walls are thick, which keeps the rooms wonderfully cool in the burning summer, and holds warmth in the surprisingly chilly nights of winter. There is little furniture by our standards. Reed mats on the floor, some low wooden stools, chests and baskets for clothes and possessions, big storage jars sunk into the floor. Beds might be simple wooden frames strung with rope, or, more often, just mats and rugs and cushions laid out on the floor at night and rolled up in the morning. The whole household possessions of an ordinary family might have fitted into a couple of chests and a few jars. A staircase, or sometimes just a ladder, leads up to the roof, and the roof is one of the most important rooms of the house. Though it has no walls, it is flat and packed hard, and it serves as workshop, storeroom, drying yard, and, above all, in the terrible heat of the Mesopotamian summer, as the family's bedroom. On summer nights, when the rooms below are stifling and the air will not stir, the whole city goes up onto its roofs to sleep, and there they lie, thousands upon thousands of families, on the flat roofs of their houses. In the merciful coolness that comes at last after midnight, under the enormous black sky of the plain, with the stars burning overhead, the vast bright stars of a world with no other lights, and the great dark shapes of the temples, and the tower rising above the sleeping rooftops. Imagine that for a moment, a whole city asleep on its roofs beneath the stars, so that if you could rise above Babylon on a summer night, you would look down on a landscape of roofs on which almost the entire population of the greatest city in the world lay quietly sleeping under the open sky. Beneath the floors of these houses lay something that would startle us, but that seemed natural to them. Their dead. In the older Mesopotamian tradition, families were often buried within the house itself, under the floor of a room, so that the ancestors remained physically present in the home, part of the household. The living were expected to care for these dead, to pour out water and food for them at the proper times, so that their spirits would rest content and would not wander hungry and angry through the world. To live in a Babylonian house was to live literally above your own ancestors, and to have among your daily duties the feeding of the dead who lay beneath your feet. It bound a family to its house and to its place in a way that is hard for us to imagine, and it made every home a small shrine as well as a dwelling. Now let us sit down with that family and see what they ate. For food is one of the most intimate windows into any vanished life, and we know a great deal about the Babylonian table. The foundation of it all was barley. Barley was the staple grain of Mesopotamia, better suited than wheat to the salty soils of the irrigated plain. And it was the basis of daily life in more ways than one. It was food. It was drink. And it was very often money as well. For wages and rents and debts were regularly reckoned and paid in measures of barley. The morning began with grinding it, and in every house in the city, in the early light, the same sound could be heard, the low grating rhythm of the grinding stone as the women of the household worked the grain into coarse flour. Hour after hour, day after day. It was hard, endless, shoulder-aching labor, and it was the price of bread. That flour became bread, baked in flat rounds on the walls of the domed clay oven in the courtyard, or as porridges and gruels, thick and filling, the true daily food of the ordinary person. Alongside the bread came the second great staple of the southern plain, the date. Date palms grew in groves everywhere along the canals and the river, and they were extraordinarily productive, yielding great heavy clusters of sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh, or dried and stored for a year, or pressed into a thick sweet syrup that served the Babylonians as we might use sugar or honey. Dates were the sweetness of Babylonian life, and the palm that produced them was valued for far more than its fruit, its wood, its fronds for matting and baskets, its fibers for rope. There is an old Mesopotamian text that praises the date palm and lists its many uses, and it reads like a hymn to a tree that gave a people almost everything they needed. To bread and dates add the rest of the ordinary diet: onions and garlic and leeks, chickpeas and lentils and beans, cucumbers and various greens, sesame, from which they pressed their cooking oil, fish from the river and the canals in great quantity, cheese and curds and butter from sheep and goats. Meat was a luxury for most people, eaten on festival days, or when an animal died, or when the temple distributed the offerings. But mutton was the favored meat when it could be had. And there were ducks and geese and pigeons and, for the rich, all manner of good things. And there was seasoning, salt of course, and cumin, coriander, mint and other herbs, and a fermented fish sauce that gave a savory depth to dishes, so that the food was not the bland stuff we sometimes imagine ancient food to be. In fact, some of the oldest written recipes in the world come from this land. Tablets recording elaborate dishes of meat cooked in broth, with fat and herbs and onions and garlic, prepared for the tables of temples and kings, and they describe a cuisine of real sophistication. And then there was beer. And here we come to something that stood very near the center of Babylonian daily life. The people of Mesopotamia were great brewers and great drinkers of beer, and their beer was made from barley bread crumbled into water and left to ferment, producing a thick, nourishing, low-strength drink, cloudy and full of sediment, which people often drank through long straws of reed or metal to avoid the husks and grit floating on the surface. There are ancient images of two people seated companionably on either side of a great jar, each drinking from it through a long straw, a picture of ordinary sociability that has hardly changed in 5,000 years. Beer was drunk by everyone, men and women, adults and children, rich and poor. It was safer than plain river water, and it was a food as much as a drink. A substantial part of the daily ration of calories. Workers on temple estates were paid in fixed measures of barley and beer. Brewing was done in the home, and also commercially, and the alehouse was a familiar institution of Babylonian city life, run in the older periods very often by women. A place to drink and talk and do business and, according to the law codes and the moralists, to get into trouble. There is even an ancient hymn to the goddess of beer that doubles as a brewing recipe, so that the making of the drink and the praising of the goddess who gave it were one and the same thing. Let us follow the family out into the day now and see how they worked, for a great city like Babylon was a hive of trades and occupations, and most of them we would recognize at once. Out beyond the walls, on the irrigated fields, were the farmers, the great mass of the population, growing the barley and the sesame and tending the date groves, moving the water along the canals, driving the plow through the heavy soil behind oxen, harvesting with sickles under the enormous sky. Their year was governed entirely by the rhythm of water and grain, and their labor fed everyone else. Among them worked the shepherds, taking the flocks out to graze on the stubble in the rougher land, responsible with their own necks for every animal in their care, since the law was severe about losses. Within the city there were craftsmen of every kind. There were potters, turning out the endless bowls and jars and cups that every household consumed and broke and replaced. There were weavers, most of them women, spinning and weaving the wool that clothed the whole population, an industry so large that whole temple workshops employed hundreds of women at it. There were leather workers and reed workers, this last a great trade in a land where reeds grew in vast marshes and were used for baskets, mats, boats, fences, and even houses. There were carpenters, working timber that had often been floated down the rivers from the distant mountains, since the plain itself produced almost no good wood. There were metalworkers in bronze and, increasingly, iron, and jewelers in gold and silver and lapis lazuli, and perfumers, and bakers, and brewers, and boatmen, and porters, and barbers, and physicians, and singers, and the countless small merchants of the market. And what a market it was! It is worth adding that a great many people in Babylon did not work for themselves at all, but for one of the two vast institutions that dominated the economy, the temple and the palace. The great temples in particular were enormous employers, holding wide estates of farmland and date groves, herds of sheep and cattle, workshops, granaries, boats, and a permanent staff running into the hundreds or thousands. They employed plowmen and shepherds and gardeners, weavers and bakers and brewers and butchers, smiths and carpenters and boatmen, doorkeepers and singers and scribes and administrators, and they fed all of them out of the temple's income. For many families, a place on the temple rolls was security, a fixed monthly ration of barley, a measure of oil, an allowance of wool for clothing, issued and recorded, year after year, in the endless account tablets that fill our museums today. Those ration lists are curiously moving documents. They record, in columns, the names of people and the amounts issued to them. So much barley to this man, half as much to that woman, a smaller measure to a child. From them we can reconstruct, with some confidence, what an ordinary person actually lived on, and how the shares differed by age and rank and sex, and how the whole complicated machinery of feeding a workforce was managed by people who had no arithmetic beyond what they had learned at the tablet house, and no tools beyond clay and a reed. And they remind us that for most people, in most of history, a life has been lived within some such institution, receiving its rations, meeting its obligations, growing old in its service. Alongside them worked the hired laborers, taken on by the day or the season for the harvest and the canal work and the building projects, paid in silver or, more often in grain, their wages sometimes specified in the law codes, and often haggled over in practice. There is a whole literature of complaint about wages and about work, bosses who did not pay, workers who did not turn up, the eternal grievances of employment. And there were the independent men and women of business, the merchants and the moneylenders and the entrepreneurs who leased temple land, or farmed the collection of taxes, or fitted out trading ventures downriver to the Gulf. Some of them building substantial family firms whose archives, spanning several generations, have been dug up more or less intact, so that we can follow the fortunes of a single Babylonian business family across a century of loans and land deals and lawsuits and marriages. Babylon sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, and into it flowed goods from everywhere, timber and stone from the north, copper and precious things from the east and the Gulf, textiles, wine, aromatics, ivory, and above all the trade in silver that oiled everything. For here is something worth understanding about the Babylonian economy. They had no coins. Coinage had not yet been invented, or at least had not yet reached them in the great age we are visiting. Instead, they used silver by weight, small pieces and rings and scraps of the metal, weighed out on scales against standard stone weights for every significant transaction. A price was quoted in weights of silver, and both parties would want to see it weighed. And for everyday matters, a great deal of business was simply done in barley, or in credit, or in obligations recorded on clay. That word, recorded, brings us to the most extraordinary thing about Babylonian life, and the reason we know so much about it. These people wrote things down, constantly, obsessively, about everything. They wrote on clay, soft tablets of river clay, held in the palm of the hand, into which the scribe pressed the wedge-shaped marks of the cuneiform script with a cut-reed stylus. And they used it not only for grand royal inscriptions and epic poems, but for the smallest business of daily life. A loan of a few measures of barley, with the interest and the date and the witnesses. The sale of a slave, a field, a house, a donkey. A marriage contract, an apprenticeship agreement, a receipt for beer, a record of a debt, a list of temple offerings, an inventory of tools, a lawsuit over a wall, a letter from a merchant to his partner, a letter from a son to his father asking for money, a complaint from a customer who felt he had been cheated on a delivery of copper. Hundreds of thousands of these tablets have survived, and every one of them is a small window into somebody's ordinary day. And they survived, of course, precisely because they were clay. Papyrus rots and paper burns, but a clay tablet, once dried, is nearly indestructible. And if the building it was stored in should happen to burn down, so much the better, for the fire bakes it hard as pottery, and it will lie in the ground unchanged for thousands of years. So we can read, today, the accounts and quarrels and contracts and love poems of people who lived 25 centuries ago. In their own words, written in their own hands, on the very objects they held. There is no other ancient civilization that speaks to us so directly, so abundantly, and so often about such small and human things. To walk through Babylon is to walk through the best documented daily life of the ancient world. Since so much depended on the written word, let us follow a boy to school. For the schools of Babylon are known to us in surprising detail, and the experience of a schoolchild there is one of the most vividly human things that survives from that world. Writing was a difficult and honored profession. The cuneiform script was not an alphabet of a couple of dozen letters, but a system of many hundreds of signs, some standing for whole words and some for syllables. And mastering it took years of relentless practice. Those who mastered it became scribes, and a scribe had status, a decent living, and access to the machinery of temple and palace and commerce. So a family with ambitions and a little money would send a son, and just occasionally a daughter, to the tablet house, the school. There the boy sat, cross-legged on the floor of a courtyard or a small room, with a lump of soft clay and a reed stylus. Copying, he copied lists. Lists of signs, lists of words, lists of trees, of stones, of animals, of gods, of professions. endless lists that had been copied by students in that land for 1,000 years before him, and would be copied for centuries after. He copied proverbs and hymns and passages of ancient literature. He learned by heart, recited aloud, and copied again. His work was checked and corrected, and mistakes were punished, sometimes with the cane. The teacher was master of the tablet house. There were assistants with grim titles like the one in charge of the whip. The days were long, beginning at dawn and running until the evening, month after month, year after year. And we know this so intimately because among the school texts that students copied, there survive little compositions about school life itself, written to be practiced by the students, and they are wonderfully vivid. In one famous piece, a schoolboy recounts his day, how he got up, how he hurried so as not to be late, how his mother gave him his lunch, and then how he was caned, again and again, by one master after another, for talking without permission, for standing up without permission, for sloppy handwriting, for poor Sumerian, for being late. Eventually his father is persuaded to invite the teacher home, to feed him well, dress him in a new garment, and put a ring on his finger, after which the teacher becomes remarkably encouraging and praises the boy's promise. It is a comic piece, no doubt exaggerated, and it is nearly 4,000 years old, and every part of it, the sleepy morning, the packed lunch, the terror of the strict teacher, the parental bribery, is instantly recognizable. There are other pieces in which older students boast about their learning and mock one another's ignorance in language that any schoolyard would recognize. Across all those centuries, children were children, and school was school. What they learned, though, was not merely handwriting. The scribal curriculum carried the whole intellectual tradition of Mesopotamia: the mathematics, the law, the literature, the omens, the hymns, the medicine, the astronomy. A fully trained scribe had absorbed a body of learning going back to the Sumerians, the people who had invented writing in that same land 2,000 years earlier, and whose language, long dead as a spoken tongue, was still studied by Babylonian schoolboys the way Latin was once studied in Europe, as the ancient language of learning and religion. Think of that. A boy in Babylon, painfully copying a dead language 2,000 years old, in a script invented in his own country before the pyramids of Egypt were built, sitting in the world's oldest continuous scholarly tradition, and knowing it. And in that mathematics lay something remarkable. The Babylonians counted not in tens, as we do, but in a system based on 60, and they were the first people in the world to develop true place value, in which the position of a sign changes its value, the idea that makes all serious arithmetic possible. They could solve problems that we would recognize as quadratic equations. They compiled tables of squares and reciprocals. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle centuries before the Greek, to whom we credit it was born. And their 60-based counting has never left us. It is why an hour has 60 minutes, why a minute has 60 seconds, why a circle has 360 degrees. Every time you glance at a clock, you are using a system of counting worked out by scribes on the Mesopotamian plain, in schoolrooms like this one, thousands of years ago. Let us look now at the shape of a family, and at the rules that governed a life. For Babylon was a society of law, and its laws touch us across the millennia with a strange mixture of the familiar and the utterly foreign. A household was headed by the father, and his authority was very great. A Babylonian family was patriarchal in a way we would find hard. But women were not without standing. A woman could own property, could inherit it, could go to court in her own name, could run a business, could enter into contracts, could be a priestess of high rank with substantial estates under her control. Marriage was arranged between families, sealed by contract and by the payment of gifts and a dowry. And the dowry, importantly, remained in a sense the wife's own, passing eventually to her children rather than being swallowed by her husband's family. Divorce was possible, and its terms were laid down in law and in the marriage contract itself. We can read those contracts today. They are dry documents, listing what the bride brings, what the groom's family gives, What will happen if either party wishes to end the marriage? And yet through the dryness one glimpses lives. The anxious parents securing a daughter's future. The careful accounting of household goods and silver, and a slave girl, and a few sheep. The witnesses gathered to see the tablet written and sealed. Elsewhere, in the letters, the same lives appear in warmer colors. A husband writing to his wife about the household. A mother scolding her grown son for not writing. A son begging his father for money in terms that any parent would recognize. Complaining that other boys receive finer clothes than he does. There is one famous letter, from a young man to his mother, in which he complains bitterly that the son of a lesser man is better dressed than he is, and demands better treatment. It could have been written last week. And children were at the center of it all, wanted, worried over, and much protected. Childbirth was the great danger of a woman's life, and it was surrounded by ritual and by anxiety. Incantations recited to keep away the demon, believed to snatch mothers and newborns. Amulets hung about the room. Prayers to the goddess who watched over birth. A child who survived those first days was named, and the names the Babylonians chose are themselves little windows into their hearts, for they were often whole sentences of gratitude or petition. The God has given a brother, or my God has had mercy, or she is the light of her father. Parents wrote their hopes and their relief directly into what they called their children. Babies were carried and nursed for a long time, sometimes for 2 or 3 years, and there were wet nurses hired by contract, with the terms recorded on clay like everything else. Small children ran about the courtyards and the lanes with very little supervision, in the way of children in warm countries everywhere, and grew up surrounded by the work of the household, learning by watching and by helping. A girl at the grinding stone, and the loom beside her mother and her aunts. A boy fetching and carrying in his father's workshop or driving the animals in the fields. Most people learned their living this way, in the family. And a trade passed from parent to child down the generations, so that a family might be potters or brewers or boatmen for centuries. For those who did not learn at home there was apprenticeship. And here again the tablets preserve the arrangements in detail. A contract in which a father, or a widow, or a temple, hands a boy over to a master craftsman for a fixed term of years, during which the master will feed and clothe him and teach him the trade, and at the end of which he must be able to practice it. There are penalties written in for a master who fails to teach, and for a boy who runs away. Adoption, too, was common, and served many purposes: to gain an heir, to secure care in old age, to take in an orphan, to bring an apprentice fully into a household. The family, in Babylon, was less a fixed biological fact than a working institution, one that could be built up and repaired by contract when life, as it so often did, took pieces of it away. Over all this stood the law, and here Babylon gave the world one of its most famous documents. Some 1,200 years before the Golden Age we are visiting, King Hammurabi had set up in his capital a tall pillar of polished black stone, carved at the top with an image of the king standing before the God of justice, and below it, in beautiful cuneiform, nearly 300 laws covering the whole range of ordinary life. It was not the first law collection in Mesopotamia. There were older ones, going back centuries further. But it is the fullest and most famous, and it lays out, in case after case, the rules of a world. And what a world it reveals! There are laws about false accusation and about perjury. Laws about theft and burglary, often carrying the death penalty. Laws about the responsibilities of shepherds and the rental of oxen, and the flooding of a neighbor's field through carelessness with a canal. Laws about the wages of a hired laborer, the fee of a boatman, the charges of a physician. Laws about builders, including the famous provision that if a builder puts up a house so badly that it collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Laws about marriage and divorce and adoption and inheritance. Laws about debt and interest, including a merciful provision limiting how long a person could be held in debt slavery, and running through it all, the famous principle of retaliation: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a bone for a bone, a phrase that has echoed down the centuries into other law codes and other scriptures, and that stands here in its original form. But the code was not uniform in its justice, and this is where it feels most foreign. Punishments depended enormously on the rank of both parties. A free man who injured a person of equal rank suffered the same injury in return, but a free man who injured someone of lower rank paid only a fine of silver. Society was tiered, and the law acknowledged the tiers explicitly. And yet, in its preamble, Hammurabi declares his purpose in words of striking moral ambition: that justice may be established in the land, that the strong may not oppress the weak, that the orphan and the widow may be protected. That claim, that the whole point of royal power is to restrain the strong from devouring the weak, is one of the oldest and most enduring statements of what law is for. And it was carved in stone on the plain of Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. Now let us raise our eyes from the household to the thing that dominated the city physically and spiritually alike: the temples and the gods who lived in them. For religion in Babylon was not a private matter of belief, tucked away in the corner of a life. It was the visible, daily, practical business of the whole city. And the gods were not distant abstractions, but residents, powerful neighbors who lived in particular buildings, ate particular meals at particular hours, wore clothes, traveled, quarreled, and had to be kept content. The chief god of Babylon was Marduk, the city's own deity, who over the long centuries had risen from being a local god of no great importance to being the king of the gods, ruler of the universe, in whose honor the great festival of the year was held. His temple, the mighty sanctuary at the heart of the city, was one of the wealthiest institutions in the world, with vast estates, thousands of dependents, herds and workshops and granaries, and its own bureaucracy of priests and scribes and administrators. And beside it rose the great stepped tower, the ziggurat, a solid mountain of brick rising in stages high above the rooftops, crowned by a small shrine at the summit. This tower was the most famous structure in the city, and its memory has haunted the Western imagination ever since as the Tower of Babel, the tower that reached toward heaven. Standing at its foot, you would have seen a mass of brickwork so vast it seemed less like a building than a work of geology, its lower stage broad enough to cover a great square of the city, its stages diminishing as they rose, with a long ramp and staircases climbing up its face, and at the very top, small and far away, the little shrine where, according to the Greek traveler who wrote about it, there was a great bed and a golden table, and no image at all, and where a woman chosen by the god was said to spend the night. The tower was not a temple in which crowds worshipped. It was, rather, a stairway, a meeting place between earth and heaven, a place where the divine could descend and the human could ascend, the mountain that the flat plain lacked, raised by human hands out of the mud of the river. And in the temple below, the daily business of divine housekeeping went on. The god was present in his statue, a figure of wood overlaid with gold and dressed in fine garments, and that statue was treated in every respect as a living king. It was woken in the morning. It was washed and dressed. Meals were set before it several times a day, real meals of bread and meat and beer and dates and fruit, laid out on tables with linen screens drawn around so that no one should watch the god eat, and afterward the food was carried away and distributed, going first to the king and then to the priests and temple staff, so that the offerings of the god became, in the end, the dinner of a great many human beings. The god was put to bed at night. On certain days the god traveled, carried in procession or by boat to visit another god in another city. And these visits were great occasions, celebrated by everyone. The greatest of all these occasions was the New Year festival, held in the spring at the turning of the year, and it lasted 11 days and involved the whole city. The gods of other cities were brought to Babylon for it. The great epic of creation was recited, the poem that told how Marduk had fought and defeated the terrible primordial ocean, split her body to make the heavens and the earth, set the stars in their courses, established the calendar, and created humankind to bear the labor of the gods. And at the heart of the festival came a moment of extraordinary drama. The king himself was brought before the god, stripped of his royal insignia, struck upon the cheek by the high priest, and made to kneel and declare that he had not sinned against the city, had not neglected the temple, had not struck the cheek of his subjects. Only then were his crown and scepter returned to him, and his kingship renewed for another year. Whatever the reality of power in Babylon, once a year, in the sight of everyone, the mightiest man in the world was humbled before something greater than himself, and had to swear that he had not abused his people. And then the great procession went out through the Ishtar Gate, along the lion-lined way, with the whole city watching, and the year began again. But religion in Babylon was not only public spectacle. It ran through the smallest details of private life, and above all it took the form of a constant, anxious attention to signs. For the Babylonians believed that the gods communicated their intentions through the world itself, that the future was written everywhere in the patterns of things, and that a wise person could learn to read it. This gave rise to one of the most extraordinary intellectual enterprises of the ancient world, the systematic collection of omens. Everything could be an omen. The behavior of animals, the shape of a newborn, the appearance of a dream, the direction of a flight of birds, the way oil spread when dropped on water, a house whose door creaked, a fox running through the town, a fire that flared in a particular way. Scholars gathered these signs into vast reference works, tablet after tablet of them, in an endless form. If such and such is observed, then such and such will follow. And the most prestigious of all divination was the examination of the liver of a sacrificed sheep, in which the trained diviner read the marks and lobes and colorations of the organ as a message from the gods, guided by clay models of livers marked out into zones. Kings did not make important decisions without such inquiries, and ordinary people consulted diviners about journeys and illnesses and marriages. Now here is the important thing, the thing that makes this more than superstition. Because the Babylonians took omens so seriously, they observed the world with tremendous care and wrote down what they saw, systematically, for centuries. And when they turned this attention to the sky, something remarkable happened. The heavens were the most important source of omens of all. And so, night after night, generation after generation, Babylonian astronomers stood on their towers and roofs and recorded what they saw, the positions of the moon and the planets, the risings and settings of stars, eclipses, conjunctions, the weather, and much else. And they dated their observations, and they preserved them. This went on, with astonishing continuity, for many hundreds of years, producing what is very likely the longest continuous scientific record ever compiled by any civilization. And out of that patient hoard of data came real science. When you have several centuries of eclipse records in front of you, patterns begin to emerge. The Babylonians discovered cycles in the motions of the moon and the planets. They worked out mathematical schemes that could predict, with genuine accuracy, when eclipses were likely, when a planet would reappear, how the moon's speed varied through the month. They developed methods that historians of science now recognize as sophisticated mathematical astronomy, arriving at results by pure computation from tables of numbers. They divided the path of the sun through the sky into 12 parts, and gave those parts the names of constellations, and so gave the world the zodiac we still use. And their astronomical knowledge passed on, in time, to the Greeks, and became one of the foundations of all later astronomy. The stargazers who first mapped these regularities were not disinterested scientists. They were looking for messages from the gods about the fate of the king and the harvest in the state. But in looking so hard, and so long, and writing down so faithfully what they saw, they became the first true astronomers, and their patient records still turn up in modern research, used to check the long, slow changes in the rotation of the earth itself. Imagine one of them on a summer night, an elderly scholar priest on a high roof above the sleeping city, wrapped against the cool of the small hours, a tablet in his lap, the stylus in his hand. Below him, the black mass of the city, the faint glow of a lamp here and there, the smell of the river. Above him, that enormous ancient sky, unpolluted by any light, blazing from horizon to horizon. He watches for the moon to reach a certain star, and when it does, he presses the marks into the clay. The day, the month, the year of the king, what he saw and when. He does not know that his observation will be read by strangers 25 centuries later, in lands he has never heard of, by people using instruments he could not imagine. He knows only that this is the work, and that others did it before him, and others will do it after, and that the record must be kept. And so it was, night after night, for centuries, under the stars of Babylon. Before we look at what happened when things went wrong, let us give some time to the pleasures of that life. For it was not all labor and law and anxious omens, and the Babylonians knew perfectly well how to enjoy themselves. Children, first of all, played, as children always have. Archaeologists digging in Mesopotamian houses turn up the evidence in quantity. Little clay animals, rattles, models of chariots and boats, whistles, tops, balls, small figurines, the ordinary rubbish of childhood. There were board games too, and one of them is famous, a game played on a board of 20 squares, inlaid in some rich examples with shell and lapis and red stone, played with counters and with dice or throwing sticks. A game of racing and chance and blocking that was played across the whole of the ancient East for thousands of years, in palaces and in guardrooms alike. We even have a tablet written by a Babylonian scholar that sets out how the game was played, so that people today can and do play it again, following rules written down more than 2,000 years ago. There was music everywhere. The Mesopotamians had harps and lyres, some of them magnificent instruments decorated with gold and shell, and the carved heads of bulls. And they had reed pipes and flutes and drums and cymbals and sistrums. There were professional singers and musicians attached to the temples and the palace, and there was ordinary singing in the streets and the workshops and the fields. Songs accompanied work, and worship, and drinking, and love, and mourning. And here, too, the clay preserved something extraordinary. Among the tablets from that world are texts that record not only the words of hymns, but instructions about how they were to be performed. Tunings for the strings of the lyre, intervals, the technical vocabulary of a real musical theory, so that we know these people thought carefully and systematically about music, and had done so for a very long time. And there were the festivals, which studded the year with days when ordinary work stopped, and everybody went out. The great New Year celebration was the largest, but there were many others, each god with his season, each temple with its processions and offerings and distributions of food and drink. On such days the city put on its color, banners and hangings, the streets crowded. The processional way lined with people, music and noise, and the smell of roasting meat. And, crucially, the distribution of the offerings afterward, meaning that on a festival day an ordinary family might eat mutton, which was otherwise a rarity. There were weddings, with their feasting and their contracts, and their gathered witnesses. There were the ordinary evening pleasures of the alehouse, the gossip on the rooftops, the visits between neighbors, the long, slow conversations that anyone who has spent time in a hot country will recognize. Conducted in the blue cool after sunset, when at last it is possible to think. And there was the river. It ran through the middle of everything, and it was not only a highway and a water supply, but a pleasure. Children swimming, fishermen out in the round reed coracles, the ferry crossings, the coolness of the water at the end of a day of heat, the boats going up and down with their sails and their cargoes, and the long green fringe of date palms along the banks, throwing shade. In a land so flat and so dry and so hot, the Euphrates was the great generous fact of existence, and its presence colors everything the Babylonians wrote about their world. Let us come back to earth and consider what happened when a Babylonian fell ill. For medicine there was a fascinating mixture of the magical and the shrewdly practical, and it tells us much about how these people understood misfortune. Illness was generally thought to have a cause beyond the body, the anger of a god, the work of a demon or a ghost, the effect of a curse or a broken oath, or a sin the sufferer might not even remember committing. And so the sick person had two kinds of specialists to turn to, and often turned to both. There was the exorcist, whose work was to identify the supernatural agent behind the illness and drive it out with rituals, incantations, prayers, and symbolic acts, figurines of the demon burned or buried, offerings made, formulas recited over the patient. And there was the physician, whose approach was more what we would recognize, and who worked from an enormous accumulated body of practical knowledge. The medical texts of Mesopotamia are extensive and orderly, descriptions of symptoms, followed by diagnoses, followed by treatments. They prescribe hundreds of substances, herbs, roots, seeds, resins, minerals, animal products, mixed into salves and poultices and potions, and administered with beer or oil or honey. They know how to bandage a wound, how to set a bone, how to treat a burn, how to dress an eye. Honey and certain resins, which we now know have genuine antibacterial properties, were applied to wounds. They observed and recorded the course of diseases with real attention. And they made an observation, thousands of years ahead of its time, that people who were near a sick person could catch the sickness. There is a famous letter from a Mesopotamian king warning that no one should drink from the cup of a woman who is ill, nor sit in her chair, nor sleep in her bed, because the disease is catching. That is a remarkably clear grasp of contagion, arrived at by plain observation, at a time when the theoretical explanation for illness was demons and divine anger. And it reminds us not to condescend to these people. Their framework was different from ours, but they were watching the world closely and drawing sensible conclusions from what they saw, and helping people as best they could. The same practical intelligence shows in the way they handled the ordinary risks of life, the debts, the disputes, the failures of harvests. A society of farmers dependent on irrigation lives with permanent uncertainty, and Babylonian life was full of arrangements to spread and manage that risk. Loans of grain at interest to get a family through to harvest. Contracts of partnership for merchants sending goods on long journeys, sharing profit and loss. Rental agreements for fields and houses and boats. Adoption arrangements that functioned as old age insurance, in which an elderly couple adopted an adult who agreed to support them for life in exchange for the inheritance. Guarantees, pledges, sureties, all recorded on clay. Sealed with the little carved cylinder seals that every person of business owned, and rolled across the wet tablet to leave a signature in miniature relief. Those seals are among the most beautiful objects that survive from that world. Small cylinders of stone, carved in reverse with scenes of gods and heroes and animals and worshippers. So tiny and so exquisitely cut that we wonder how it was done with the tools of the time, and worn on a cord around the neck or wrist. A person's seal was their identity, their signature, their legal self. When the tablet was written and the deal agreed, out came the seal, and it was rolled across the damp clay, and the little procession of figures appeared in relief along the edge. And the thing was done and binding. 2,500 years later, we can still see those impressions, sharp and clear, exactly as they were pressed by a hand that has been dust since before the Persian Empire fell. Let us take a walk now through a whole ordinary day in the city, from waking to sleeping, and simply live in it for a while, with nothing to learn and nothing to solve, only the rhythm of a vanished day to rest inside. It begins before dawn, in the gray light, with the sound of grinding. All across the city, in 100,000 courtyards, the stones are turning, and the barley is becoming flour, and the ovens are being lit, and the first smoke of the day rises straight up into the still air. The air is cool, almost cold, the only cool hour of a summer day, and everyone is glad of it. Families come down from the roofs where they slept, rolling up their mats. Water is fetched from the well or the canal. There is bread and beer and dates, eaten quickly, sitting on the floor or standing in the courtyard. Then the city opens. Doors swing back onto the lanes. The donkeys come out, and the porters with their loads, and the noise begins to rise. Farmers who live in the city walk out through the gates toward their fields in the gathering light, tools over their shoulders. The boatmen push off from the riverbank in their round coracles of reeds and skins, spinning gently as they cross the brown water. Craftsmen open their workshops onto the street, and the sounds of the trades begin. The tap of the metalworker, the creak of the loom, the slap of wet clay on the potter's wheel. Scribes settle into shaded doorways with their baskets of clay, ready to write letters and contracts for anyone who needs one and cannot write for himself. In the temple, the god is being woken and washed and fed, and the first offerings of the day are being carried in. By mid-morning, the market squares are full. There is haggling over barley and dates and dried fish, over wool and pots and reed baskets, over onions and garlic in heaps. Silver is weighed on small scales. Somebody is arguing loudly about the quality of a delivery. Somebody else is having a document written and witnessed, and the witnesses are standing about impatiently in the sun. A woman sells beer from a jar in the shade of a wall. Children run everywhere, underfoot, shouting. Then the heat comes. By the middle of the day, in summer, the heat of the Mesopotamian plain is a physical weight, an immense shimmering pressure, and the city slows, and then very nearly stops. The streets empty. People withdraw into the deep shade of their thick-walled rooms and lie still. The dogs sprawl in doorways. The workshops fall quiet. Even the river seems to move more slowly. For several hours, the greatest city in the world simply waits, breathing shallowly, for the sun to loosen its grip. And then, in the late afternoon, as the light turns golden and the shadows stretch long and blue across the dust, the city comes back to life. And this is the best hour of the day. People come out again. The work resumes for a while, and then eases. The gossip starts. Men gather at the alehouse. Women call to one another across the lanes, and from the roofs. The processional way glows in the low sun, and the blue of the great gate deepens and burns. The evening meal is cooked in the courtyards, and the smell of it drifts through the whole city. Bread and onions and fish and oil. Somewhere a musician is playing a lyre, and there is singing. And then the light goes, quickly, as it does in that latitude, and the enormous night comes down. Lamps are lit here and there, small clay lamps with a wick floating in sesame oil, giving a warm and tiny light. The gates are shut. Somewhere out beyond the walls a jackal calls. The heat still radiates from the brick, and the family climbs the stair to the roof and spreads the mats, and lies down in the open air and looks up. And there, over the dark shape of the tower, over the sleeping city, over the flat black plain and the shining river, stand the stars of Babylon, thick and blazing and countless, wheeling slowly through the warm dark, exactly as they have wheeled for all the thousands of years that people have lain on those roofs and watched them, and exactly as they wheel tonight, over you, over your house, over the roof above your head. Before we leave the great buildings, let us consider the other power that loomed over ordinary life alongside the temple, the palace, and the king. For a Babylonian, the king was not a distant political abstraction, but a presence that reached into daily affairs in 100 practical ways. He was, in theory, the shepherd of his people, appointed by the gods to keep order, to maintain justice, to defend the land, and above all, to build. And build he did. The inscriptions that Babylonian kings left behind are strikingly unlike the boastful war annals of some of their neighbors. They dwell less on slaughtered enemies and more on temples restored, walls raised, canals dug, gates rebuilt in glazed brick, foundations relaid exactly upon the lines of the ancient foundations beneath. To be a good king in Babylon was, above all, to be a good builder and a good maintainer, a restorer of what the ancestors had made. That building program touched everyone. The bricks had to be made, millions upon millions of them, and stamped, many of them, with the king's name, so that even today one may pick up a brick from those ruins and read the name of the man who ordered it made. The labor had to be raised, and much of it came as a duty owed by ordinary subjects, a certain number of days of work each year on the canals or the walls or the temples, alongside the taxes owed in grain and dates and silver and wool. Behind all this stood a large administration of officials and scribes and overseers, keeping lists, issuing rations, recording who had served and who had not, whose fields owed what, who was in arrears. Anyone who has ever dealt with a tax office would recognize the mood of these documents entirely. And the palace itself was an enormous establishment, a city within the city, courtyards opening one into another, storerooms, workshops, quarters for officials and guards and craftsmen, and the royal household, and at the heart of it the throne room, its facade blazing with glazed brick in blue and yellow and white, with columns and palmettes and striding lions, so that a visitor approaching along the great court would see the king seated at the center of a wall of color and light. Foreign envoys came here, and provincial governors, and the heads of the great temples, and captive kings from conquered lands who were kept at the Babylonian court with allowances of oil and barley, their rations carefully recorded on tablets that survive to this day, so that we can read, in a palace account, the exact provision made for a defeated foreign king living out his life as an honored prisoner in the greatest city on earth. For most people, though, the king was less a person than a weather system, the source of the peace that let the trade move, of the projects that demanded their labor, of the taxes that took a share of their crop, of the occasional proclamation that wiped out debts and set things briefly right. They saw him truly once a year, perhaps, at the great festival, when he walked in the procession and was humbled before the god. The rest of the time they knew him as a name on a brick, a date on a contract, and a claim upon their working days. Now let us come to the great sights of the city, the things a visitor would have gone home talking about, and to the most famous puzzle among them. For Babylon in its glory was full of marvels, and the greatest of them, in the memory of the later world, was a garden. The story goes that somewhere in Babylon there was built a vast artificial garden, raised up on terraces, tier above tier, planted with great trees and flowering shrubs, watered by some ingenious machinery that lifted the river water up to the highest level so that it could trickle down through all the terraces below. A green mountain of leaves and blossom rising out of the flat brown plain and hanging, as it seemed, in the air. The ancient writers listed it among the 7 wonders of the world. They said that a king had built it for his queen, who came from a green and mountainous country and was homesick for the hills and forests of her homeland, so that her husband raised her an artificial mountain of gardens in the middle of the desert plain, so that she might walk among trees again. It is one of the loveliest stories the ancient world has left us, and it may not be true. Here is the difficulty. The Greek writers who describe the hanging gardens all wrote long after the time when the gardens are supposed to have existed, and none of them, so far as we can tell, saw them. And on the other side, the Babylonians themselves, who wrote down everything, who recorded the most tedious details of building projects, who left us long inscriptions in which their great builder king boasts at length about every wall and gate and temple he restored, never mention a great garden at all. Not once. Nor have the archaeologists who have dug at Babylon found anything that can be confidently identified as the remains of such a structure. It is an odd silence, and it has led some scholars to suspect that the whole story is a romance, or a confusion, or a transplanting into Babylon of something that really existed somewhere else. There is a serious argument that the famous gardens were in fact built not at Babylon at all, but at the great Assyrian capital to the north, by a different king in a different century, watered by an aqueduct, whose remains do survive, and that later writers, muddling 2 famous cities of Mesopotamia, attached the wonder to the more famous name. We do not know. Perhaps the garden stood in some part of the city that has never been excavated, or that the shifting river has washed away, for the Euphrates has moved its bed since ancient times, and taken parts of the old city with it. Perhaps the whole thing is a dream, and there is something rather beautiful about that uncertainty, that the most famous wonder of the most famous city in the ancient world, Maybe a thing that never existed at all, and yet has been more vividly imagined, and more often painted and described and longed for, than 100 monuments that certainly did. Whether or not any king ever raised a green mountain over Babylon, the idea of it has been growing in the human imagination for 2,500 years, and in that sense the gardens are quite real, and are still there, and always will be. What certainly did exist was magnificent enough. The Great Gate and the processional way, blazing with blue and gold. The vast palaces with their courtyards and their throne room, its facade glazed with palm trees and lions and floral patterns in brilliant color. The tower, mounting stage by stage above the roofs. The immense walls. The bridge over the Euphrates. The temples, dozens of them, for Marduk was far from the only god with a house in the city. And the sheer size and density and noise of the place, which for people from smaller towns must have been overwhelming. A city of hundreds of thousands crammed onto that dusty plain, drawing in food and goods, and people from an entire empire, the greatest concentration of human beings than existing anywhere on earth. We should not paint the picture too warmly, though, for there were hard things in that life, and an honest visit must acknowledge them. Babylon was a society with slavery in it. Some slaves were prisoners taken in war. Some were people sold into it by their families in desperate years. Some were born into it, and some were free people who had fallen into debt and been seized or had sold themselves to pay what they owed. Their situation varied enormously. Some were household servants. Some labored on temple estates. Some were skilled craftsmen who worked more or less independently and paid a portion of their earnings to their owner. And some managed to accumulate property and even to buy their freedom. They could marry, and the children of a slave and a free person had rights. Slaves appear constantly in the tablets, being bought, sold, inherited, hired out, running away and being recovered, with their names and prices and distinguishing marks recorded in the dry language of business. It was not the brutal plantation slavery of later centuries, but it was slavery, and it was woven right through the fabric of ordinary life. There was inequality of other kinds, too. The great temples and the palace, and a relatively small number of wealthy families held enormous resources, while most people lived close to the edge, dependent on the harvest, vulnerable to a bad flood, or a failed crop, or a rise in prices. Debt was the great trap of ordinary life, and the law code's provisions about interest rates and debt slavery exist precisely because the problem was real and constant. Periodically, a new king might proclaim a general cancellation of certain debts, a clean slate, wiping out arrears and freeing those held for debt, which tells you both how bad the problem became, and that the society recognized it as a danger to itself. And life was fragile, in the plain way that all pre-modern life was fragile. Many children died young. Women died in childbirth. Epidemics swept through the crowded quarters. Injuries that we would treat in an afternoon could kill or cripple. The sun and the labor wore bodies out early, and a person of 50 was old. When the archaeologists study the bones from Mesopotamian cemeteries, they find the marks of it: arthritis in young adults from heavy labor, teeth ground down by the grit in the stone-milled flour, healed fractures, the ordinary damage of a hard-working life. The people who lay on those roofs beneath the stars had aching backs and worn teeth and buried children. And yet, and this is the thing to hold on to, they built and traded and sang and studied and married and argued and made contracts and told jokes and complained about their teachers and worried about their sons. And they did it for century after century, on that hot, flat plain, with immense energy and ingenuity. When you read the tablets, what comes off them is not misery but life. Dense, busy, quarrelsome, funny, ordinary life. A merchant furious about the quality of copper he has been sent, writing a letter of magnificent sarcasm. A man complaining that his brother has cheated him. A woman running an estate and giving crisp instructions. A schoolboy's exercise with the teacher's correction still visible. Someone practicing their signs and, in the margin, idly drawing a picture. Small, human, immediate things, pressed into mud, 25 centuries ago, and still here. One more thing must be said about who lived in that city. For Babylon at its height was not a place of one people speaking one tongue. It was an imperial capital, and imperial capitals draw the world into themselves. Walking its streets, you would have heard Babylonian, the old language of the land, still the tongue of scholarship and law and religion, but you would have heard, more and more commonly, Aramaic, the practical everyday speech that was spreading across the whole Near East, and would in time replace the old language altogether, written not on clay, but in an alphabet, with ink, on parchment and papyrus, so that most of what ordinary people wrote in those later centuries has simply rotted away and left the clay tablets of the conservative scribes as our main witness. And beyond those two, you would have heard the languages of merchants and soldiers and laborers and deportees from every province, from the Levant, from Egypt, from the mountains of the north and the marshes of the south, and the highlands of the east. For the Neo-Babylonian Empire, like the Assyrian Empire before it, moved peoples about. When a rebellious city was subdued, its leading families, its craftsmen, its priests and scribes, might be uprooted and resettled far away, in Babylonia, where they could be watched, and where their skills could be put to use. The most famous of these deportations is the one recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures, when Jerusalem was taken, and a large part of its population was carried off to Babylon, an event that burned itself into the memory of a people, and produced some of the most beautiful and sorrowful poetry ever written about exile, the lament of those who sat down by the rivers of Babylon and wept when they remembered their home. And on the Babylonian side, quite independently, we had the administrative tablets, dry palace records listing rations of oil and barley issued to a captive king of Judah and his sons, living out their days at the Babylonian court. Two utterly different kinds of document, from two sides of the same event, and both have survived, and we can lay them side by side. The exiles were not, in general, enslaved. They were settled in communities, often in the countryside, given land to work, allowed to keep their own leaders and customs and religion, expected to pay their taxes and serve when called. And we know a good deal about how such communities lived. Because they too wrote on clay, there are archives from villages of deported peoples in Babylonia, full of the ordinary business of farming and debt and marriage and inheritance, with the names of the families preserved. Some of them prospered. Some, when at last they were permitted to return home, chose not to go, having built lives in the land of their exile over 2 or 3 generations. Babylon, for all that it stood in memory as the great oppressor, was also for many thousands of people simply the place where they lived, and where their children were born, and where they were buried. This is what a great city does. It gathers. It takes people from everywhere, willing and unwilling, and mixes them, and in a generation or two their descendants are speaking the language of the streets, and doing the trades of the city, and reckoning themselves at home. Babylon was the first place in the world to do this on such a scale, the first true metropolis, and everything we associate with a great city, the crowding, the noise, the languages, the trade, the anonymity, the opportunity, the loneliness, was being invented and experienced there, by ordinary people, for the first time. Let us listen, then, to what these people made of their own lives. For the Babylonians left not only accounts and contracts, but literature, and it is among the oldest literature in the world, and it is astonishingly good. The greatest of it is a long poem about a king of a city far older than Babylon, a poem already ancient in Babylonian times, and copied and recopied by their scribes, telling of a proud and restless ruler, of the wild man who becomes his beloved friend, of their adventures together, and then of the friend's death, and of the king's shattering discovery that he too must die. It is that second half of the poem that has kept it alive for 4,000 years, for it is one of the first works of literature in which a human being confronts the fact of death and refuses to accept it. The king, wild with grief and terror, throws off his kingship and wanders the wilderness, filthy and half-mad, searching for a way to live forever. He crosses the waters of death. He finds the one man who was granted eternal life, and hears from him the story of a great flood that once drowned the world. A story with such striking similarities to a later and more famous flood narrative that its discovery in the 19th century astonished the scholars who first read it. And in the end, after everything, the king fails. He loses the plant of youth to a snake. He goes home empty-handed. And the poem closes with him standing before the walls of his own city, looking at the brickwork, telling his companion to admire how well it is built. That is the answer the poem offers. You will die, and you cannot help it, and what you may have instead is the work of your hands, the city you built, the walls that will stand after you, the ordinary life you were too proud to value while you had it. Somewhere along the way, in an older version of the story, a tavern keeper tells the grieving king to go home, to eat and drink and be content, to hold his wife close and let his children take his hand, because the life the gods gave to humankind is this one, and it is enough. It is very old advice, and very good advice, and it was written down on clay in Mesopotamia, before Rome existed, before Athens existed, before Jerusalem was a city of any note. They had other literature too, and it ranges wider than you might expect. There was the great creation epic recited at the New Year. There were hymns of real beauty to the gods, and laments for cities that had been destroyed, poems of grief for ruined places written with an ache that carries perfectly across the millennia. There were proverbs, hundreds of them, dry and shrewd and often very funny, about lazy workers and grasping merchants and unwise marriages, and the folly of speaking before thinking. There were riddles and drinking songs and satirical pieces, including a famous dialogue between a master and his servant, in which the servant agrees enthusiastically with every contradictory whim his master expresses. A piece of comic and rather bleak philosophy. There were love poems, tender and frank. There were letters written by people who had no idea anyone but the recipient would ever read them, and those may be the most moving of all. And there were, of course, the scholarly texts, the omen collections, the mathematical tables, the astronomical diaries, the medical handbooks, the lists and glossaries, the copies of ancient Sumerian works maintained by scholars long after the language had died. Babylon was, in its later centuries, a great center of learning, and of the deliberate preservation of a very old tradition. Its scholars conscious of themselves as heirs to an inheritance thousands of years deep, working to keep it intact and pass it on. Some of the last cuneiform tablets ever written, from long after Babylon had lost its political power, are astronomical texts, produced by the descendants of these scholars, still calculating, still recording, still keeping the tradition alive in a world that had moved on and largely forgotten them. And a life there was shaped, above everything, by the turning of the year, so let us follow that turning. For the Babylonian year had a rhythm quite unlike ours, and it governed every ordinary existence on that plane. The year began in the spring, at the first new moon after the spring equinox, with the great New Year festival, and that beginning made sense, for spring was when the world came back. The months were lunar, each beginning when the thin new crescent was actually sighted in the evening sky by watchers appointed for the purpose, which meant that months ran 29 or 30 days, according to observation, and that the ordinary calendar of the greatest empire on earth depended, month by month, on someone standing on a roof at dusk and seeing whether the moon had appeared. 12 lunar months, though, fall about 11 days short of a solar year, and if nothing were done the calendar would drift backward through the seasons, so that in a few years the spring festival would be falling in winter. So an extra month was inserted from time to time to keep the calendar in step with the sun, at first by royal decision when the seasons had visibly slipped, and later, as the astronomers grew more sophisticated, according to a fixed and elegant cycle that they worked out from their centuries of records, a scheme in which 7 extra months are added over 19 years, which brings the lunar and solar years back into almost perfect agreement. That cycle is still used today in more than one traditional calendar. It was worked out on the plain of Babylon by men who had been watching the sky, and writing down what they saw, for longer than any nation of the modern world has existed. Within that year, the farming rhythm ruled. The barley was sown in the autumn, when the terrible heat finally broke, and it grew through the mild wet winter, and was harvested in the spring. And the harvest was the great anxious labor of the year. Everyone in the fields, the whole community's fate riding on those few weeks. The dates ripened in the late summer, and were gathered in the heaviest heat of all. Between and around these came the endless work of the canals, clearing, dredging, repairing the banks before the rivers rose. And the rivers rose at an awkward time, in the late spring, from the melting snows of far-off mountains, so that the flood came not when the crops needed it most, but when they were nearly ripe, which is why so much of the ingenuity of that civilization went into storing and steering water rather than simply receiving it. Each month had its festivals and its ominous days, days when certain work should not be begun, days for offerings to particular gods, days for the dead. And every family knew the pattern. The winter brought a few weeks of real chill and gray skies and mud, and people huddled in braziers' warmth and complained. The spring brought green over the whole irrigated plain, an astonishing sight in that landscape, and the festival, and the harvest. The summer brought the great heat, months of it, when nothing much could be done between mid-morning and late afternoon, and the whole city moved onto its roofs at night. The autumn brought sowing, and the beginning again. Round and round, year after year, generation after generation, for thousands of years, the same turning, the same sowing and reaping, the same watching for the new moon at dusk, on the same flat, hot, fertile plain between the rivers. And what became of it all? The golden age we have been walking through did not last long. The great builder king died after a long reign, and within a generation the Neo-Babylonian empire he had raised so high was gone. The last of its kings was an odd and interesting figure, a man more interested in antiquities and in the worship of the moon god than in the politics of his capital, who spent years away from Babylon in a distant desert oasis and left his son to govern in his place, and who managed along the way to offend the powerful priesthood of the city god. And in his reign, the armies of a new and rising power came down upon Mesopotamia, the Persians, under their brilliant King Cyrus. The end came quickly, and remarkably, almost without violence. The Babylonian army was defeated in the field, and then the great city with its immense walls that no one could have stormed simply opened. The Persians entered, and the city was not sacked. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator and a restorer. A king who came to set right what the last Babylonian ruler had neglected, who honored the city god and confirmed the temples in their privileges and let the priests carry on. There is a famous inscription, written on a clay cylinder in Babylonian cuneiform, in which Cyrus announces exactly this, describing how he entered the city in peace, how the people welcomed him, how he restored the shrines, and let displaced peoples return to their homelands. It is a document of royal propaganda, certainly, but it is also an early and striking statement of a policy of tolerance, and it has been famous in modern times for that reason. And so Babylon passed under Persian rule, and then, 2 centuries later, to Alexander of Macedon, who took the city and, it is said, planned to make it a capital of his enormous new empire, and who intended to rebuild the great tower, and who died there, in Babylon, in a palace by the river, still a young man, before any of it could be done. After him the city passed to his squabbling successors, and a new capital was founded not far away, and the trade and the population and the importance drained slowly toward it. The Euphrates shifted its bed, the canals silted, the great temple estates dwindled. The city shrank quarter by quarter over centuries, from a metropolis to a town, from a town to a village amid enormous ruins, until at last there was nothing there but mounds of broken brick and a few farmers, and the name, which everyone still knew, though almost no one could have told you where the place was or what it had looked like. But it did not vanish in a night, and it did not vanish completely, And here is one of the loveliest small facts about the long ending of Babylon. The last securely dated cuneiform tablet we possess, the last surviving document written in the script that had carried the learning of Mesopotamia for 3,000 years, is an astronomical text written in the 1st century of the Common Era, when the Roman Empire was already old, when the city was a ruin, and the empire long gone. Somewhere in those ruins, generations after everything else had faded, someone was still watching the sky, and still pressing the old wedge-shaped signs into clay, keeping the tradition of the astronomers going to the very last, until finally there was no one left who could read it, and the script went silent. And the long conversation that had begun with the first accountants of Sumer 3,000 years earlier came at last to an end. For the better part of 2,000 years after that, Babylon was a word, rather than a place. Everyone in the Western world knew the name, but they knew it from scripture and legend, rather than from any real knowledge. Babylon, the great city of pride and luxury. Babylon of the tower that reached for heaven and was struck down and scattered the tongues of humankind. Babylon of the exile. Babylon of the writing on the wall. It had become a symbol, a moral, a shorthand for splendor and arrogance and downfall, and the actual city, the mud-brick metropolis, with its schoolboys and brewers and astronomers, was entirely forgotten. Travelers crossing that plain saw mounds and thought little of them. The cuneiform script could no longer be read by anyone alive. An entire civilization, one of the very oldest, had disappeared into the ground and into legend. And then, in the 19th century, it came back. Explorers and then archaeologists began to dig into the mounds of Mesopotamia, and they found palaces and libraries and, above all, tablets. Tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of clay tablets covered in that unreadable script. And at the same time, in one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern age, scholars set themselves to cracking the script, working from trilingual inscriptions carved on a Persian cliff face, painstakingly assigning values to signs, arguing, testing, until, after decades of labor, cuneiform gave up its secret, and the tablets began, quite literally to speak. Imagine the moment when a scholar first read a Babylonian letter and understood that a man had written it to his brother about a shipment of grain 3,500 years before. Imagine the shock when the flood story was first read aloud to a learned society in London, and a whole civilization's literature stepped out of the dark. And so, over the past century and a half, the ordinary life of Babylon has been recovered in extraordinary detail from the mud, in the very documents that its people wrote and threw away. That is why we can talk tonight about what they ate for breakfast, and what a schoolboy complained about, and how much a hired laborer earned, and what a woman brought to her marriage, not from grand histories written by kings, but from receipts and letters and homework, the accidental archive of a whole society, preserved because it was written on the most ordinary and most durable material in the world. The Great Gate itself was excavated by German archaeologists early in the 20th century, and its glazed bricks, thousands upon thousands of fragments, were carefully removed, shipped to Europe, and painstakingly reassembled, so that today a portion of the Ishtar Gate stands reconstructed in a museum in Berlin, and you can walk down a section of that processional way between the striding lions, and see with your own eyes exactly what a Babylonian saw: the blue, the gold, the beasts, the scale. It is one of the most extraordinary encounters with the ancient world available anywhere. And at the site itself, on the plain in Iraq, the mounds and foundations remain, marked and mapped and much argued over, with a modern reconstruction raised over part of the ruins, and the Euphrates still running past, a little way from where it used to run, through the same hot flat country, under the same enormous sky. And what of the inheritance? For a civilization that vanished so completely, Babylon left a surprising number of things behind in the daily furniture of our own lives. Things we use without ever thinking where they came from. Look at a clock. 60 seconds, 60 minutes. The 60 base counting of Mesopotamian scribes. Look at a circle divided into 360 degrees. The same. Look at a horoscope in a newspaper. With its 12 signs, the zodiac was laid out along the sun's path by Babylonian astronomers. The 7-day week, the naming of the days for the sun and moon and planets. The practice of watching the heavens for meaning, the very idea of dividing the year and the sky into standard parts. All of this comes down to us, by long and winding roads, from that plane. Deeper still, they gave us the habit of writing things down, of keeping records, of putting an agreement into a permanent form that could outlive the memory and the honesty of the people who made it. They gave us the law code, the idea that the rules should be set out publicly, in fixed words, so that everyone might know them, and the king himself be measured against them. They gave us schools and curricula and libraries and the profession of the scholar. They gave us the first great literature, and with it the discovery, still fresh 4,000 years later, that a story can hold a human being's grief and fear of death and make something bearable and beautiful out of it. Much of what the Greeks learned and passed on to us they had, in some measure, from this older world. And much of the imagery of the scriptures that shaped the West was formed by peoples who lived beside and among the Babylonians and knew their stories. But perhaps the most valuable inheritance is not any of these particular gifts, but the simple fact of the encounter itself, the chance to look, in unusual detail, at how human beings lived at the very beginning of urban life, and to find them so recognizable. That is the thing that stays with you after you have spent time among the tablets. Not the strangeness, though there is plenty of strangeness, but the familiarity. The parent worrying about a child's schooling, the complaint about shoddy goods, the young man who wants better clothes, the proverb about a lazy worker, the couple arranging their affairs so someone will care for them when they are old, the teacher, the brewer, the boatman, the woman running her household, the old scholar on the roof watching the sky. We tend to imagine that people in the deep past were fundamentally different creatures, that their inner lives must have been as remote from ours as their world was. And then you read their letters, and it turns out they were us, the same worries, the same jokes, the same love of comfort and children and gossip and a good drink at the end of a long hot day. 25 centuries is a very long time. It is longer than the whole history of Christianity, more than twice the age of any modern nation. And across that gulf, a man complains that his brother has cheated him, and we know exactly how he feels. That is not a small thing. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most reassuring discoveries a person can make, that whatever else changes, and everything else does, the shape of a human life stays much the same. That we belong to an enormously long and continuous company of people who have all been doing more or less the same things, in more or less the same spirit, for as far back as the record reaches. Let us go back into the city one last time, at the very end of a day, and simply be there quietly, with nothing left to explain. It is late. The sun has gone down behind the flat rim of the plain, and the sky above Babylon has turned the deep and luminous blue of the great gate itself. That blue that holds the light for a long while after the sun has gone. The heat is loosening at last. The dust that hung golden in the air all afternoon has settled. Down in the lanes it is already dark, and the little clay lamps are being lit in the courtyards, one by one, small warm points of light appearing all across the city as the families gather. The river runs black and smooth beneath the bridge, carrying the last reflections of the sky. On the quays, the boats are tied and empty. The workshops are shuttered. The market squares are swept and abandoned, and a dog trots across one of them, nose down, entirely at ease. In the temple, the god has been given his evening meal and put to bed, and the great doors are closed, and the priests move quietly through the courts with lamps. On the processional way, the lions in their glazed brick have gone dim and blue in the dusk, still striding, as they will stride through all the nights and all the centuries to come. Up on the roofs, the families are settling. The mats are unrolled. The children, who have been running all day, are put down and are asleep, almost before they are still. Somewhere someone is talking softly, and someone else laughs, low, and then that, too, fades. The last of the cooking smoke thins away into the dark, and the great tower stands over it all, a black shape against the stars, and at its summit, so high and so far, there is perhaps a single small light burning. And the stars come out over Babylon. First a few, and then, as the blue drains from the sky, more and more, until the whole enormous dome of the heavens is crowded with them. Hanging low and bright over the flat plain, in a way that no one who has only seen a modern sky can quite imagine. The scholar on his high roof marks the position of the moon and presses the wedges into the clay. A watchman walks the wall. The city breathes slowly, all around, hundreds of thousands of people lying on their roofs beneath that sky. Each one of them a whole world of hopes and troubles, each one of them entirely forgotten now. Every single one, their names and faces and voices gone as completely as the smoke of their evening fires. And yet here we are, thinking of them, in the dark, 25 centuries later. Somebody is still thinking of them. That seems a small thing, and perhaps it is, but it is not nothing. They lay under those stars and worried about their debts and their children and whether the canal would hold. And they slept, and the night passed over them, and the next day came, and they got up and ground the barley and lit the ovens and went on. And in time they died, all of them, and their city died, and the mud went back to being mud. And still, tonight, the stars they watched are turning overhead, and someone is telling their story softly in the dark, and you are listening, half asleep, and for a moment the whole vast distance between you closes to nothing at all. And now our long walk through the streets of Babylon draws toward its close, and it is time to let it all come gently, to rest, and to let yourself come to rest along with it. So let your mind begin to release the details now, the way you loosen your hold on the day's business as sleep draws near. Let the kings and the laws and the dates and the names blur softly together and drift away. You need hold on to none of it. Keep only, if you keep anything, the feeling of the place, the blue gate glowing in the evening light, the smell of bread and river water, the low sound of the grinding stones at dawn, the roofs full of sleeping families under the enormous stars. Let your thoughts go back, one last time, to where we began, to that golden evening on the processional way. Stand there again now. The paving is warm beneath your feet. On either side the lions stride along beside you through their field of deep blue, glowing in the last of the sun. Ahead, the great gate rises, brilliant and improbable, and beyond it the tower climbs stage by stage toward a sky that is just beginning to deepen. The city hums around you, unhurried, going about its evening as it has gone about 10,000 evenings before. There is nowhere you have to be. There is nothing you have to do. There is only the warmth, and the color, and the sound of a great old city settling into its night. And as you stand there, let this be the gentle thought that carries you down toward sleep. All of those people are gone now, every one of them, and they were as real as you are. They loved their children as you love yours, or as you were loved. They lay awake sometimes, as you have lain awake, worrying about money, or about someone they cared for, or about nothing they could name. And all of that has passed, entirely, and left behind only some broken brick, and a great deal of clay, and the memory of a name. But it has also left behind this, the seconds on your clock, the degrees of a circle, the days of your week, the very habit of writing things down. Their ordinary days are woven, quietly and invisibly, into your ordinary day, and in that way they are not so far off as they seem. And perhaps there is a comfort in that for you tonight. The troubles that press on you now, that seem so heavy and so urgent in the small hours, will one day be as thoroughly finished as the troubles of the man who wrote to complain about his copper. That is not a bleak thought, but a kind one, if you let it be. It means you may set them down for tonight. Nothing needs solving before you sleep. Nothing needs holding. The city ground its barley and lit its lamps and slept beneath its stars for 1,000 years without your help. And the world will turn tonight without your watching it. You have done enough today. You may rest. For you are one more person lying down at the end of a long day, in the immense and unbroken company of everyone who has ever done so, back and back through all the centuries, to those families on their flat roofs beneath the stars of Babylon. And that is not a lonely thought, but a companionable one. You are in good company. You always have been. And tonight, your only task is to let the day go, and let the old city fade, and let the quiet carry you down. So let your breathing slow now, and let it deepen, and let your body grow heavy and warm and still, sinking down into the quiet like a lamp burning lower and lower in a darkened room. There is nothing more to do tonight. The long walk is over. The city has been seen, and its people met, and their day followed from the grinding of the barley at dawn to the spreading of the mats upon the roof, and now it may all be gently let go. Let the last images grow soft and dim, and drift away into the dark. The blue gate, fading into the blue of the evening. The lions, going quiet in their brickwork. The river, black and smooth, sliding on past the sleeping quays. The tower, a shadow among shadows. The courtyards with their little lamps going out, one after another, all across the city, until there is only the dark, and the warm brick giving back the heat of the day, and the vast slow wheel of the stars. Let it all soften and recede, a beautiful thing visited once, in the quiet of a night, and now released, the way you release the day itself as you sink toward sleep. There is nothing left to hold. There is nothing left to fear. There is only the quiet, and the warmth, and the slow soft tide of rest, rising to carry you away. The old plain lies still beneath its stars, as it has lain through so many thousand nights. The river runs on in the dark, as it has always run. The mounds sleep under the grass and the dust, keeping their tablets and their broken walls, patient beyond all patience. And the stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that the astronomers of Babylon wrote down on clay so long ago, keeping their ancient watch as they kept it over the sleeping rooftops then, and as they keep it now, over your roof, over your room, over you. And you may rest now, as deeply and as peacefully as that old city rests beneath its earth and its enormous sky, carried down gently into the dark, and the quiet, and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may simply let these words fade, and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if ever you find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting. Another old city or vanished age to wander through together in the dark. Until then, from the warm brick and the blue gate, and the wide dark plain beneath its ancient stars, I wish you nothing but stillness, and comfort, and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet. And I wish you a calm and peaceful night.